In this video, we are going to cover some best practices when we're building web applications. And if we don't follow those best practices, well, guess what, my friends? They can be full of vulnerabilities, and we don't want that, right? So we want to make sure that anytime we launch our application through UAT or development cycles and then into production, we want to make sure that that source code is being managed, it's being identified, and obviously determined if there's any vulnerabilities or security risks that are associated with it. And the very first component that helps us deliver that is SCAR. And SCAR is pretty much a process, and SCAR by definition is software composition analysis, and this is basically the process that identifies and tracks the use of third-party software, again, that open source component, and those libraries that are associated with those functions within that code base. So basically the SCAR tools are used to analyze the software dependencies and define or identify maybe vulnerabilities, maybe licensing issues, or any other sort of risks that are associated with that third-party component. So typically what we would have is a developer that goes away and builds a web application. Maybe this is running in a certain language, and there's a specific function that's required. So the developer then doesn't need to go out and reinvent any wheels or reinvent the code base or the application stack. So thanks to, again, that open source licensing, so put open source licensing, he or she can go away, he can implement some sort of open source code into that platform, and then that provides that functionality. Well, the question then is embedded is, well, what happens when we launch that into UAT and then eventually prod? Well, most cases we forget that that code is there, often causing, again, vulnerabilities. So we don't want that to happen. We want to make sure that that process of code that's put in and that's open source, it's identified. If there's any security risks, then we can go away and analyze those. So with SCAR, again, it's a piece of code that we can sort of begin to scan and analyze its application for those open source pieces, right, that are potentially across the application. And then once we've identified them, we can ensure that that code is not vulnerable once we've deployed it into production. So again, SCAR is that tool set that allows us to search and identify those vulnerabilities if they do exist. Again, things like licensing issues, and again, maybe something like our security risks. And that's SCAR in a nutshell. Now, moving on from SCAR, we've got other things like our frameworks. And our frameworks are typically, let me just reword that, that's a bit of gibberish. So our frameworks, and these are typically tool sets, or again, sort of types of development tools or languages that are coming with different tools and features, right? So could be Angular, could be Node.js, could be .NET. Yeah, that's a framework that we can use. Could be React. And these are all sort of, these are all frameworks that can help us build out web applications, right? This is the software modules that we can then plug into the framework, and then they can also provide functionality, right? So we can use modules and functions, and then obviously vulnerabilities and then associated to those modes or to those functions that are associated with the different frameworks that are available to us. So everything we use that we basically develop the application, it needs to be managed and maintained, and obviously be free of any security risks. We also have things like unsafe functions. So I'm just going to say unsafe functions. And these could be things like the get function, right? So if we have a certain parameter that we can do a get request over to a web server, and this basically allows users to create or to enter characters and hit the enter button and enter data into the application. And then we basically get that information back from that web server. It could be maybe header information or whatever the function is. So the idea behind that is we want to hard code and prevent those unsafe functions that, well, we don't want to use them firstly if it's not sanitized and properly filtered. Let's just say that there's this get request here that we're entering. And what happens in that get request if we enter maybe 1,000 lines of code? Well, that's a security risk. Maybe that's an unsafe option, right? So we don't want those unsafe parameters to exist. So we want to then hard code what is allowed, and then obviously filter out what is an acceptable amount of data that we can potentially enter, and then filter that out. So we want to make sure that there's checks against that function, which is the inputs, And then if it falls within specific boundaries, then obviously that information can then be reciprocated and be replied back, once we're using, let's say, for example, this get request information. We also have third party, and I'm kind of running out a bit of real estate here, but we've also got third party libraries. And this is basically, a collection of usable resources, whether it's code, document, and we can import these libraries into the application to get or to use those resources. So if we take a third-party library, we put our application into it, and then we get those resources where it provides to integrate with our application. So third-party libraries, basically come from third parties, and that's sometimes a risk right there. So we want to make sure that if we are utilizing third party, I'll just clean that up a little bit. If we are using third party libraries, that we obviously identified these libraries and who and what we need to do within these libraries. So we need to manage and scan these for maybe security risks. So scan for security risks. If there's security risks exist, maybe there's end of life or end of software. End of software support. So if that life cycle is coming out of its support cycle or it's no longer supported, maybe there's a risk with that end of life system. And then obviously the software library dependencies and managing what we put into our application code stack. So we want to be mindful again of those third-party libraries. Again, there's other things like inherent. I'm just going to do another line just down here. And then there's typically inherent vulnerabilities. And these typically exist across the different functions, again, different frameworks that we're using. So our .NET framework, maybe our Angular framework, different libraries, modules, functions. And then we want to take those vulnerabilities and obviously define what they are, understand what they're doing. Does it need to be patched? Does it need to be scanned? Is there end of life support? And define that way. Once we put this program into our production environment, we've identified any potential risks. Now, they're the sort of the areas of this. So we've got our SCAR that we've mentioned. So that's one. We've got our third-party libraries that we need to be mindful of. We need to be mindful of our frameworks that we're using. There's unsafe functionality within the applications that we need to be mindful, and then our inherent vulnerabilities that exist cross-functionally across these different platforms. So hopefully you found this video useful. In this video, in summary, we've discussed all things software development vulnerabilities. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and as always, I will see you in the next video.